When a bitter frost grips St. Mary Mead, a quiet English village, the stillness is shattered by a chilling discovery. A man found lifeless on frozen lane, his footprints vanishing mid-snow. The villagers whisper of ghosts and curses, but Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and sharp intuition, suspects a far more human mischief. Behind lace curtains and teacups lie secrets of greed, jealousy, and deceit. As winter deepens, so do the lies. And only Miss Marple can untangle the frozen truth before the thaw reveals all. Chapter 1. The Frosted Morning. The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on its quiet respectability. Nestled among rolling meadows and hedgerows dusted with snow, it was a picture from a Christmas card. Smoke curling from cottage chimneys, cobblestones glittering with frost, and the faint chime of the church bell echoing through the still air. But that particular morning, beneath the peaceful white hush of winter, something was amiss. At precisely 8:30, Mr. Henry Ashworth, the village postman, was trudging down Frozen Lane, a narrow path shaded by tall firs whose branches bent under the weight of the snow. His breath puffed in steady clouds as he whistled a cheery tune, until he noticed, halfway down the lane, what looked like a bundle of clothing lying by the hedgerow. He slowed, frowning. The shape was too still, too deliberate. When he stepped closer, his heart lurched. There, half covered in powdery snow, lay Mr. Peter Linton, the owner of Linton's Grocers and Provisions, a man known for his punctuality, his polished manners, and his occasional bursts of temper when a delivery arrived late. His gray wool coat was neatly buttoned, his hat a few feet away, and his spectacles cracked on the ground beside him. His face, pale and still, bore an expression of mild surprise, as though death had come upon him quite suddenly. Henry Ashworth stumbled backward, heart hammering. "Good Lord," he whispered. "Mr. Linton." The snow muffled his voice. For a moment he stood frozen, torn between fear and duty. Then, gathering himself, he turned and ran up the lane toward the village, his boots crunching wildly. By 9:30, the news had spread, as all news did in St. Mary Mead, with astonishing speed. By 10 o'clock, every kettle in the village had boiled, every curtain had twitched, and speculation was steeping as hot as the morning tea. At the Bluebell tea rooms, Mrs. Dolly Bantry was already holding court with Miss Hartnell and Miss Weatherby, their heads close together like conspirators. "Collapsed in the snow, they say," Dolly whispered, though her voice carried across the room regardless. "Found by the postman, poor man, dreadful shock." "Heart attack, surely," said Miss Hartnell. "He was a man of hearty appetites." Miss Weatherby shook her head gravely. "I heard there were footprints, strange ones, circling the body. That caused a stir. Footprints in fresh snow, that sort of thing always set imaginations alight." Meanwhile, at a neat little house on the high street, Miss Jane Marple was trimming the spent leaves from a pot of pink geraniums when her housekeeper Florence came rushing in, cheeks flushed. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never believe it. They've found Mr. Linton dead on Frozen Lane." Miss Marple looked up calmly, her blue eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. "Dear me," she said softly. "Mr. Linton? Such a capable man. Did they say what happened?" "Heart, I think," Florence replied, "though Mrs. Bantry says he looked odd." "Odd?" Miss Marple repeated, setting down her scissors. "Yes, his hat was found a few feet away and there were no marks of him falling. Strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded faintly, her mind already turning over the details. "Frozen Lane, you say? I might take a little walk that way. Fresh air will do me good." Florence gasped. "You're not going near, are you, ma'am?" Miss Marple smiled. "Just a walk, my dear. Curiosity, you know, is an old friend of mine." By the time Miss Marple reached Frozen Lane, the constable, Sergeant Simmons, had already cordoned off the area with a piece of twine that looked far too cheerful for the grim occasion. A handful of villagers stood nearby, whispering behind gloved hands. Sergeant Simmons, a young man still new to the village, greeted her respectfully. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I'd best ask you to keep a bit back. Official business." "Of course, Sergeant," Miss Marple said pleasantly, though she positioned herself where she could see everything clearly. The body had been removed, but the scene told its own story. The snow was disturbed only in a narrow circle around where the body had lain. There were Mr. Linton's own footprints, firm, deliberate, leading from the village toward the spot. Then about a yard from the body, another set appeared, smaller, lighter prints coming from the opposite direction. But here was the curious thing. Those second footprints stopped abruptly beside where the body had been found. There were none leading away. Miss Marple observed quietly, her eyes tracing the impressions. "Fascinating," she murmured. Later that afternoon, the village gathered in subdued clusters outside Linton's grocer's, which now stood closed, a handwritten sign pinned to the door. "Closed due to bereavement." Miss Marple, basket on her arm, exchanged a few words with Mrs. Beatrice Linton, the widow, a woman of sharp features softened by grief. "It's such a shock, Miss Marple," Mrs. Linton said, her voice trembling. "He was perfectly well when he left after supper. Said he had to check something at the shop, an account book he'd forgotten. Why he went by Frozen Lane, I'll never know." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "Perhaps he wished to avoid the high street. It can be rather talkative at times." Beatrice managed a wan smile. "Yes, he did hate gossip. And he carried the key to the shop with him, I presume?" Mrs. Linton frowned faintly. "Yes, always. But they didn't find it on him." "Didn't they?" That small detail hung in the air like a note of dissonance in a quiet melody. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resting forgotten on her lap. She thought about the footprints. One set belonging to Mr. Linton, clear, unbroken, walking toward his fate. Another lighter set appearing from the opposite side and vanishing. A simple accident could be easily explained. A weak heart, a slip on the ice. But missing keys and vanishing prints did not fit comfortably in that narrative. She recalled Peter Linton's nature, industrious, frugal, and somewhat vain of his respectability. He had owned the grocers for 20 years, and though respected, he was not universally loved. Some said he overcharged during shortages. Others said he'd quarreled with his delivery man only a week ago. And then there was his assistant, Miss Lucy Pryor, a quiet girl who had recently given notice, claiming she'd be leaving the village soon. The next morning brought new developments. Sergeant Simmons arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand, looking perplexed. "Thought you might like to know, ma'am. Dr. Haydock's confirmed it wasn't a heart attack. Said Mr. Linton died from asphyxiation. Someone strangled him with a thin cord or scarf." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Dear me, in our peaceful little lane." "Yes, and there's more. No signs of struggle. So whoever did it must have surprised him. Or someone he trusted," Miss Marple added gently. Simmons nodded gravely. "We've a few names, of course. Mrs. Linton, naturally. Then there's the delivery man, young Tom Reeves, and Lucy Pryor, the shop girl. Also Mr. Alfred Linton, the brother, came back from London last week. Folks say there was bad blood over money." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. 4 suspects, then. How very tidy. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a deliberate detour to the grocer's. Through the frost-clouded window, she could just make out Mrs. Linton inside, tidying shelves that no one would see for days. When she entered, the little bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that felt oddly out of place. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, I wonder if you'd allow me a few moments." Mrs. Linton looked weary but nodded. "Of course. I can't imagine what the world is coming to, Miss Marple." Peter gone. And now they say it wasn't natural. "I fear so," Miss Marple said. "But perhaps we might help the police by remembering a few small things. Did your husband receive any troubling letters lately?" Beatrice hesitated. "He did get one last week. Brown envelope, no return address. He looked pale after reading it, then burned it in the grate. I asked, but he wouldn't tell me what it said." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Men do dislike unpleasant reminders." Her gaze drifted toward the counter. A row of string spools was neatly arranged by the scale, the sort used for tying parcels. She noticed one missing from the peg. "How very tidy you keep things, Mrs. Linton. I envy such order." Beatrice smiled faintly. Peter liked everything in its place. "Yes," Miss Marple said, eyes glinting. "I rather think he did." That evening the snow fell harder. The village lamps glowed in a soft haze, and the world seemed wrapped in white silence. But inside Miss Marple's cozy sitting room, the silence was alive with thought. She had taken out her old notebook, the one she used for her village parallels, as she called them. She believed every great mystery had its echo in some small village happening, if only one looked closely enough. She wrote at the top of the page, then she paused, gazing into the fire. A memory stirred, an old story of young Mrs. Harris years ago, who'd hidden a debt by falsifying shop accounts and then blamed the mistake on the clerk. When the truth came out, it had been over a missing key, much like this one. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "People do repeat themselves," she murmured. "Only the details change." The next day dawned brittle and bright. Frozen Lane glittered under the morning sun, the snow crusted into diamonds. Miss Marple walked there again, her boots crunching softly. At the far end she stopped. Something glinted faintly beneath the hedge, a bit of metal half buried in the frost. She bent carefully and lifted it, a small key engraved with the initials PL. "Well," she said, brushing the snow away, "how very obliging of the Lane to keep its secrets only half hidden." She slipped the key into her pocket, her expression thoughtful. That afternoon she called upon Dr. Haydock, who was sipping tea in his surgery. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a grin. "You've come about poor Linton, I suppose." "Just a small question," she said lightly. "Would you say the murderer was strong?" "Not necessarily," he replied. "The marks suggest precision, not brute force. Could have been done by someone slight if they knew how." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions quietly aligning. "Thank you, Doctor, that's most enlightening." As she left, she passed Lucy Pryor, the shop assistant, walking briskly with her suitcase in hand. "Leaving already?" Miss Marple asked kindly. Lucy hesitated. "Yes, Miss Marple, I thought it best. Too many questions here." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And too many answers, perhaps, if one isn't careful." That night, as the village slept under its frozen quilt, Miss Marple sat by the window, watching the snow drift across the lane. She held the recovered key in her hand and smiled faintly. "The truth," she murmured, "is like snow. Soft enough to hide footprints, but never forever. The thaw always comes." And with that, she laid the key beside her notebook, the faint crackle of the fire marking the rhythm of her thoughts. In St. Mary Mead, mysteries rarely stayed buried long, not with Miss Marple about. Chapter 2. Whispers over tea. The following morning dawned pale and silver, the snow outside Miss Marple's window lying smooth and untouched, like a fresh page waiting to be written upon. Inside, her kettle sang gently, filling the room with the comforting hiss of steam. The fire flickered low, and the scent of toasting bread mingled with that faintly medicinal aroma of lavender polish that always clung to her little sitting room. For all the world, it could have been an ordinary winter morning in St. Mary Mead, had the air not been buzzing with quiet tension. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Death, she mused, had a way of rearranging the village's daily rhythms. People who rarely spoke suddenly found excuses to exchange confidences. Others, usually bold, became wary and careful in their words. A tragedy was a mirror, revealing what people were made of. She took her wool shawl from the chair, fastened it neatly, and stepped out into the frosty air. There was much to be learned this morning, not from the police, but from the village's own tea tables. At the Bluebell tea rooms, conversation was in full bloom by the time Miss Marple arrived. Mrs. Dolly Bantry waved her over eagerly from a corner table where Miss Hartnell and Miss Weatherby were already leaning in, cups half forgotten in saucers. "My dear Jane," Dolly exclaimed as Miss Marple approached, "you must hear what Mrs. Price told me. They say the inspector from Much Benham is on his way. Murder, he called it. And imagine, here in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple sat with a small smile. "One should never be surprised, Dolly. Human nature is quite as lively in villages as in cities. Only the scenery differs." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Well, I still say it was his heart. The doctor can talk about cords and strangulation all he likes, but Peter Linton was not a well man." "Except," Miss Weatherby said significantly, "they found that his shop key was missing, and there's talk of a quarrel about money with his brother." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Ah, yes, Mr. Alfred Linton. He returned from London only last week, I believe." "Indeed," Dolly said, lowering her voice. "Rumor has it he came to ask Peter for funds. The grocer refused. They had words, and Alfred stormed out. A terrible temper, that one." Miss Marple took a delicate sip of tea, saying nothing. She preferred to let gossip unspool naturally. It was amazing how much truth hid in idle chatter. By noon, Miss Marple decided to take a stroll toward the vicarage, where she often found both tea and information of a more measured kind. Reverend Leonard Clement and his good-natured wife Griselda welcomed her warmly. "Oh, Miss Marple," Griselda cried, "isn't it ghastly, poor Mr. Linton, and on Frozen Lane of all places? Why, I walked there not 2 days ago." "Ghastly indeed," Miss Marple said mildly, "though I suppose no one can quite understand what took him out so late." The vicar shook his head. "Linton was not a man given to evening walks, that's certain. But I understand he was anxious over business matters. Perhaps he went to clear his head." Griselda leaned closer. "Between ourselves, I think it's more than business. I've heard his assistant, Lucy Pryor, had a dreadful row with him last week. She gave in her notice quite suddenly." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Lucy Pryor. A pretty girl, I recall." "Pretty and sensible," said Griselda, "though perhaps a little too proud for her position." "Pride can be dangerous in small villages," Miss Marple said softly. "It breeds resentment, and resentment, my dear, can be a seed for very poisonous growth." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a polite call on Lucy Pryor herself. The girl was lodging temporarily with her aunt, Mrs. Partridge, in a cottage near the old mill. Lucy opened the door looking pale but composed, her fair hair pinned neatly beneath a wool beret. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, managing a smile. "I suppose you've heard. Everyone has." "I'm afraid one cannot avoid it, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "I only wanted to see how you were holding up. It must have been a dreadful shock." Lucy hesitated, then invited her in. The room was small but tidy, smelling faintly of lavender and starch. "I can't believe he's gone," Lucy said after a moment. "Mr. Linton could be difficult, but he wasn't cruel. He just wanted things done his way. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. And was that why you left? Lucy's lips tightened. Partly. I'd had another offer in Eastbourne, and... She hesitated. It's silly, but lately the atmosphere at the shop felt... unpleasant. He was short-tempered, distracted. Once I found him sitting alone in the back room, staring at nothing. When I asked if he was all right, he said, "You can't trust anyone in this village anymore." Then he told me to leave him. Miss Marple made a mental note. You didn't see him again after that evening? No, ma'am. The next morning he was gone. I meant to send for my wages, but now, well... Her voice trembled. I don't know what to do. Miss Marple patted her hand. You'll do as you've always done, my dear. Keep your head high and your conscience clear. Truth has a way of coming to light, just like the sun through thawing snow. When Miss Marple returned home, she found Sergeant Simmons waiting at her gate, stamping his boots. Good afternoon, ma'am. Thought you might like an update. Always, Sergeant, Miss Marple said, ushering him in. He took the offered chair by the fire, grateful for the warmth. We've identified everyone who might have seen Linton that night. His wife says he left about 9. The postman found him at 8:30 the next morning. Between those hours, nothing. And the brother? Alfred Linton's staying at the Red Fox Inn. Claims he was there all evening. The landlord confirms it. Says he came in about 7, left after closing, but... Simmons hesitated. No one saw him return to his room until nearly midnight. Miss Marple said softly. A convenient gap. Yes, and the landlady mentioned his boots were wet when he came in. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she resumed her knitting. Snow, Sergeant, tells tales even when lips will not. Simmons nodded grimly. We also spoke to young Tom Reeves, the delivery lad. Seems Linton caught him skimming coins from the till a few weeks back. Fired him on the spot. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. Injustice, even when deserved, leaves a bitter taste. Tom says he's innocent, but he was seen near the shop that night. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People often are seen where they shouldn't be, especially young men in love. Tell me, Sergeant, has he ever been fond of Miss Pryor? The young constable blinked. Well, now that you mention it, yes, everyone knows it. Then perhaps his errand that evening was not theft but affection, Miss Marple said, and such matters are rarely tidy. That evening brought another visitor, Mrs. Beatrice Linton, widow of the deceased, her face pale under a black veil. I hope you don't mind my calling, she said softly. I don't know who else to speak to. The inspector was here earlier. He asked dreadful questions about money, about my marriage. Sit, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. A cup of tea makes all things bearable. Beatrice clasped the warm cup gratefully. I feel so ashamed. Peter and I, we weren't happy. He was proud, controlling. But I never wished him harm. Miss Marple listened quietly. He thought his brother was after his savings, but truthfully... She hesitated, glancing toward the fire. There was very little left. The shop was failing. Rationing's been hard on small businesses. He borrowed against the property, something even I didn't know until the solicitor came today. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. So financial troubles indeed. Yes, and that letter he burned, it must have been about that loan, or perhaps from the lender himself. He was secretive lately, often out after dark. He said he was meeting suppliers, but who meets suppliers in the snow? Who indeed, murmured Miss Marple. When Beatrice rose to leave, she clutched Miss Marple's hand. If you learn anything at all, please tell me. I must know who did this. Miss Marple's expression softened. My dear, you will. but sometimes knowing brings little comfort. She tapped her pen against her lips. So many possibilities, but the simplest explanations were rarely correct. Outside, wind rattled the window panes and the church clock chimed 9. The rhythm of village life continued. Kettles boiled, curtains twitched, and secrets deepened beneath the snow. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Red Fox Inn under the pretense of collecting a parcel from the post coach. Inside, she found Mr. Alfred Linton, tall and neatly dressed, his features bearing a sharper, more cynical version of his late brother's. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "You must be Peter's brother. Such a sad affair." He glanced up, wary. "Indeed, madam. I assume the whole village is talking." "Only as villages do," she replied mildly. "I believe you were fond of your brother?" He snorted. "Fond? We tolerated each other. He took the family business, left me the debts. I went to London to make my own way. And now, well, it seems he made a mess of his affairs after all." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You returned conveniently, though. Family instinct, perhaps." He stiffened. "I came because he wrote to me. Said he had an offer that could benefit us both. Something to clear the slate, as he put it." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "How intriguing. And this offer, did he ever tell you what it was?" "No. He died before we could speak." Alfred drained his cup. Typical of Peter, always leaving things half done. When Miss Marple left the inn, she smiled faintly to herself. The pattern was beginning to emerge. A missing key, a burned letter, a financial scheme. Perhaps the truth lay not in hatred, but in desperation. That afternoon, the thaw began, just slightly. Thin rivulets of water trickled along the gutters, and the pristine white of frozen lane turned slushy and gray. Miss Marple stood at its edge once more, her sharp eyes studying the ground where the footprints had been days before. There was something symbolic, she thought, about the way the snow erased and revealed in equal measure. She noticed a faint glimmer by the hedge, the very spot where she'd found the key. Stooping, she brushed aside the damp snow and found a small fragment of twine, frayed at one end. It matched precisely the kind used for parcel wrapping at Linton's grocer's. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed the fragment beside the key on her writing desk. The evidence was modest, 2 small, ordinary things, yet together they spoke volumes. She smiled softly. "People do so love to think crime is complicated," she murmured. "But more often than not, it's quite the opposite." Her knitting needles clicked again, rhythmic as a heartbeat. The picture was forming in her mind, a tangle of debt, pride, and opportunity, all wrapped neatly in the quiet folds of village life. And as the evening deepened, Miss Marple made her decision. Tomorrow she would call upon Inspector Graves from Much Benham and share what she had begun to see through the frost. Chapter 3. The 4 Suspects. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had settled into that peculiar rhythm that follows any village tragedy. A blend of gossip, sympathy, and speculation, all neatly wrapped in routine. Curtains fluttered as people passed, and behind every lace window pane someone whispered another theory. But while most residents sought comfort in chatter, Miss Jane Marple sought truth, and truth she knew often hid in plain sight. She rose early, made her tea, and laid out a sheet of thick cream paper on her writing desk. Across the top, in her fine looping hand, she wrote, "Suspects in the death of Peter Linton, as observed by J. Marple." Beneath it, she listed 4 names, each followed by a neat blank line. Those blanks, she thought with satisfaction, would be filled before the day was done. The first call of the day was to the Red Fox Inn, where Mr. Alfred Linton, the dead man's younger brother, was finishing his breakfast. He looked immaculate in a pinstriped suit, though the circles under his eyes hinted at sleeplessness. Miss Marple, he said politely as she entered the small dining room. You've caught me just before I was leaving. How fortunate, Miss Marple replied cheerfully. I was hoping for a brief word. Alfred gestured for her to sit. The police have already questioned me twice, you know. I'm afraid I can't tell them much. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said, setting down her gloves. But sometimes it's the little things that matter. Tell me, did your brother mention any specific concern before his death? Alfred hesitated. Only that he'd received an offer. He wouldn't say from whom, only that it would solve everything. Frankly, I thought it another of his self-important boasts. But now, he trailed off, gazing at his teacup. Miss Marple's eyes softened. You quarreled with him last week, I believe? His jaw tightened. That's hardly a secret. He accused me of begging. Said I'd squandered Father's trust. I told him he'd made himself a petty tyrant behind that counter of his. It wasn't pleasant. And afterward, I left, went to the inn, had a drink and stayed there until closing. You may ask the landlord. I have, Miss Marple said mildly. He recalls you returned late with wet boots. Alfred stiffened. It was snowing, Miss Marple. Yes, she said. And yet, so curiously, there was no fresh snow after 9 that night. For a moment his eyes flickered, a tiny break in composure. Then he smiled thinly. You've quite the memory for weather. One must in a village, Miss Marple said pleasantly, rising. The weather explains so much, from illnesses to crimes. Her next visit took her to the modest Reeves' cottage at the edge of the village green. There she found Tom Reeves, the former delivery boy, mending a bicycle chain outside. His face was pale, his hands nervous. Good morning, Tom, Miss Marple said kindly. A cold day for tinkering. He wiped his hands on his trousers. Mornin', Miss Marple. I suppose you've come about Mr. Linton. Indeed, she said. I understand things were difficult between you two lately. He sighed. He thought I'd been stealing. I swear I hadn't. I'd never touch his money. Lucy could tell you that. I dare say she would, Miss Marple replied. You were fond of her, weren't you? Tom's face turned crimson. Everyone knows that, I reckon. But she didn't fancy me that way. Still, I looked out for her. When Mr. Linton started shouting at her last week, I wanted to step in, but she told me to leave it. Did you see her that evening? He nodded. I went by her aunt's to check she was all right. Stayed a few minutes outside, didn't want to cause talk. Then I walked home, passed by the shop and saw the lights still on. I thought Mr. Linton was working late. I didn't think much of it. Miss Marple tilted her head. And you didn't notice anyone else about? Tom hesitated. Maybe. There was someone down the lane, near the hedgerow. Could have been Alfred Linton. Hard to tell in the snow. Miss Marple's eyes glinted, though her voice remained gentle. And you didn't mention this to the police? He swallowed. No, ma'am. Didn't seem my place. Quite right, Miss Marple said softly. Best to be sure before one adds to the noise. Still, such small observations can prove most illuminating. From the Reeves' cottage, Miss Marple made her way back toward the high street, where the black drapes of mourning still hung in the window of Linton's grocer's. Inside, Mrs. Beatrice Linton was sorting through stacks of unopened invoices, her face drawn but composed. My dear Mrs. Linton, Miss Marple said, you look exhausted. I hope you're taking some rest. Beatrice shook her head. There's too much to do. The solicitor's been, the police have been, everyone's been. I do apologize for intruding again, Miss Marple said, but there are 1 or 2 little puzzles I can't quite fit together. You mentioned your husband burned a letter last week. Do you recall any details about it? Beatrice frowned slightly. only that it came from London. He was agitated afterward. I thought it was about money, though he denied it. Did you ever see who delivered it? The postman, as usual. Why? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because sometimes the sender is as interesting as the message itself. Her eyes drifted toward the counter. The spools of string were neatly arranged once more, except that one peg remained empty. I wonder, Miss Marple said gently, whether your husband often used string for anything outside the shop? Beatrice blinked. No, never. Why? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple replied lightly. Merely curiosity. But as she stepped out into the cold, her mind was already fitting that missing spool beside the small piece of twine she'd found in the snow. That afternoon she called at Mrs. Partridge's cottage again, hoping to find Lucy Pryor at home. The girl answered the door almost immediately, as though expecting her. Miss Marple, Lucy said, eyes wide, is there any news? I'm afraid not, at least not the kind one hopes for, but perhaps you can help me untangle a small confusion. Lucy gestured her inside. The air smelled of baking bread and furniture wax. You worked at the shop for nearly 2 years, did you not? Yes, ma'am. And you were the last to leave on the night before Mr. Linton's death? I believe so. He said he'd lock up himself. I left around 8:30. Miss Marple nodded. Did you notice anything unusual? Lucy hesitated. Well, he seemed distracted. He kept looking out the back door as if expecting someone, and, this may sound silly, he'd put on his best coat, not his work one. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured, as if he were meeting someone of importance. I thought perhaps his brother, Lucy said, but Mr. Alfred didn't come by that night. I would have seen him. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. She glanced toward the small table near the window. On it lay a folded scarf, dark wool, finely made, but with a small tear along one edge. How lovely, Miss Marple said, touching it gently. Did you make this yourself? Lucy shook her head. No, ma'am. Mr. Linton gave it to me last Christmas. Said it was a thank you for my hard work. Miss Marple smiled faintly. So kind of him. And do you still wear it? Lucy's fingers brushed the tear. Not lately. It caught on something and tore. I meant to mend it. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the scarf for one thoughtful second too long before she thanked Lucy and left. Back in her cottage, she found Inspector Graves waiting by her fire, a stout, capable man with the cautious respect of someone who knew Miss Marple's reputation all too well. Ah, Miss Marple, he said, rising. Sergeant Simmons tells me you've taken quite an interest in this case. I do like to keep my mind occupied, she replied. Idle fingers, idle thoughts, both are dangerous. Graves smiled. Well, perhaps you'll find this interesting. We've found traces of shop twine on the victim's collar. Same kind used at Linton's grocer's. How fascinating, Miss Marple said, seating herself. A domestic weapon, then. How very English, the inspector chuckled. We're still sorting out motives. The wife had reason, money. The brother had reason, inheritance. The boy had temper. And the girl, perhaps shame or fear. It's a tidy enough circle. Too tidy, Miss Marple said softly. Real life rarely arranges itself so neatly. He raised an eyebrow. You've seen something? She hesitated. Perhaps only a pattern. But patterns can be quite revealing, Inspector, especially in woolen. And lies. He looked puzzled. She smiled serenely. That evening, as twilight deepened into indigo, Miss Marple sat once again before her fire, her knitting untouched beside her. On the table lay 3 objects, the shop key, the fragment of twine, and a scrap of wool she had quietly snipped from Lucy's torn scarf when the girl wasn't looking. Holding them side by side, she compared the fibers. The wool was finer, darker, but the twine bore a faint trace of that same dark thread, almost imperceptible, as though the scarf had once brushed it closely. She looked toward the fire, eyes bright. "Ah," she murmured, "so that's how it happened." Later that night, Sergeant Simmons called again, hat in hand. "The inspector asked me to let you know, ma'am. They've confirmed the time of death, between 9 and 10 o'clock. "Very helpful," Miss Marple said. "And where, pray, was Mrs. Linton at that time?" "At home with her neighbor, Mrs. Price. Alibi checks out." "And Mr. Alfred?" "At the inn till just after 11, though he might have slipped out for half an hour." Miss Marple nodded. "I see. And young Tom Reeves?" "Claims he was home by 9:30. His mother confirms." "And Lucy?" "Her aunt says she was in bed early, around 9. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, yes. But in St. Mary Mead, in bed often means behind a locked door thinking of something one shouldn't." Simmons looked puzzled. "Beg pardon, ma'am?" "Nothing, Sergeant. Just an old woman's rambling." But after he left, Miss Marple took up her notebook again. Beneath the suspect's names, she began to fill in the blanks. Mr. Alfred Linton, motive, greed, weak alibi, but impulsive, not cunning. Mrs. Beatrice Linton, motive, fear of ruin, alibi firm, not physical enough for strangulation. Tom Reeves, motive, revenge, jealousy, but heart too soft for murder. Lucy Pryor, motive, unknown, gifted scarf torn, twine fibers match. In bed early, lies. She drew a small line beneath Lucy's name and wrote 3 words. The scarf fits. Then after a long pause, she underlined the phrase and added another. But why? Because that, she knew, was the heart of every mystery. Not how, but why. The next morning she would visit Frozen Lane one last time, and when she returned she would know precisely which truth lay buried beneath its snow. Chapter 4. A Clue in the Snow. The morning after her quiet reflections, Miss Jane Marple woke before dawn. Outside her window, the first light of day revealed a world glazed in frost, every hedge, gate, and roof sparkling under a veil of pale silver. The church bells, muffled by the cold air, tolled softly for morning prayers, but Miss Marple had other devotions in mind. She dressed warmly, fastening her heavy coat and tying a woolen scarf about her neck. As she set out toward Frozen Lane, the village was only beginning to stir. Chimneys smoked, and the faint scent of baking bread drifted from the bakery. Frozen Lane itself lay hushed, untouched since the constables had finished their work. The snow there was half melted now, streaked with muddy tracks and the imprint of boots both official and otherwise. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple knew some traces always lingered. "Nothing truly disappears," she murmured to herself. "It merely hides where careless eyes won't look." She stopped at the spot where Peter Linton had been found, near the old yew tree that leaned crookedly over the lane. The snow was thinner there, marked with a faint depression where his body had lain. A small wooden cross now stood beside it, set by the vicar's wife the previous evening. Miss Marple bent slowly, her keen blue eyes scanning the ground. She traced the faint outline of footprints, though the melting snow had softened their edges. 2 distinct sets led toward the lane, one larger, with a confident stride, the other smaller and lighter, turning back in haste. 2 visitors, she murmured. One to arrive and one to regret arriving. Her gaze fell next on something half buried beneath the ice. A tiny metal clasp, no bigger than a button, dull and rusted at the edges. She lifted it carefully with her gloved fingers, brushing off the frost. It was the sort of clasp used to fasten a wool scarf. For a long moment, Miss Marple stared at it in silence. Then, tucking it neatly into her pocket, she straightened and turned toward the churchyard gate. At the vicarage, she found Reverend Hale poring over his morning letters. He was a mild man of about 60, with spectacles perpetually slipping down his nose. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted warmly. "Out early, I see. Cold morning for a walk." "Yes, indeed," she said. "I've been to Frozen Lane. Such a desolate little corner, isn't it?" The vicar sighed. "A dreadful thing, that poor man's death. I confess I never much liked him, but one shouldn't speak ill of the departed." "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though one might sometimes think ill on their behalf. Tell me, Reverend, do you recall whether Mr. Linton attended service recently?" "Not in months," the vicar replied. "He was proud, I think, believed his success placed him above parish obligations." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the frosted window pane. "And did you happen to notice any unfamiliar faces about the village this past week?" He frowned thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, a man from London came through on Tuesday. Stayed one night at the Red Fox Inn. Business of some kind. With Mr. Linton, I gather. Tall, with a gray hat." Miss Marple's mind ticked quietly. A letter from London, an unknown visitor, and a promise that would solve everything. "I do thank you," she said warmly. "You've been most helpful." Leaving the vicarage, she paused by the churchyard gate and looked once more toward the distant lane. She could just make out the dark smudge of the yew tree stark against the snow. Then faintly she saw a figure there, small, slight, and wrapped in a pale coat. It was Lucy Pryor. Miss Marple watched as the girl knelt beside the wooden cross, her shoulders trembling. When she rose, she did not return toward the village, but instead turned down the side path that led toward Merrick Wood, where the stream ran shallow and half-frozen. Miss Marple, curiosity piqued, followed from a discreet distance. The path wound between bare hedges and brittle grass. Lucy walked quickly, glancing over her shoulder once or twice, then stopped near the water's edge. She knelt, reached into her coat pocket, and drew out something wrapped in cloth. Miss Marple's breath caught. The girl hesitated, then tossed the bundle into the icy stream. A flash of red wool caught the light before it sank beneath the water. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured softly once Lucy had gone. She waited until the girl was out of sight before stepping forward. The current was weak. With the help of her umbrella, she coaxed the cloth to the bank and pulled it free. The wool was unmistakable, the same dark scarf she had admired at Lucy's cottage. Only now it was badly torn and stiff with frost. Around one end clung a loop of grocer's twine. Miss Marple folded the scarf neatly, her expression grave. "Poor child," she whispered. "Such foolish mercy often leads to tragedy." Later that morning, she took tea with Inspector Graves at the station office, bringing the damp scarf carefully wrapped in paper. The inspector looked up as she entered. "You've been busy, Miss Marple." "One must keep one's hands occupied," she said lightly. "I've brought you something." He unwrapped the bundle, frowning. "A scarf?" "Not just any scarf," Miss Marple said. "It belonged to Lucy Pryor. I found it this morning, or rather I found her trying to dispose of it." Graves examined the twine. "Same type as the murder weapon." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "It appears to have been used to restrain someone. Tightly. You can see where the wool's fibers have been stretched and broken." The inspector nodded slowly. "Why would she throw it away?" "Because she feared it would condemn her," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet I do not believe she was the killer." Graves leaned forward. "Go on." "Consider this," she continued. "Lucy is small, barely 5 feet. Mr. Linton was a grown man of heavy build. To strangle him, even with a cord, would require strength and surprise, but I suspect the scarf was not used to kill, but to cover something." "Cover?" "Yes, to conceal the twine itself, perhaps after it snapped, or to disguise bruising." Graves frowned. "You think someone used her scarf deliberately?" I think, Miss Marple said, eyes glinting, that someone took it from her coat that evening, perhaps while she was visiting Mr. Linton, and later replaced it without her knowing. Graves exhaled sharply. Alfred Linton, then? Possibly, but not necessarily. She hesitated, knitting her fingers together. Tell me, Inspector, have you yet traced that visitor from London? He shook his head. Not yet. The innkeeper remembers him leaving early Wednesday morning. Paid in cash, no address. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. And no one saw him speak to Peter Linton? Not directly. But we found cigarette ends of a foreign brand behind the shop. Could be his. Or someone else's, Miss Marple murmured. Do you recall which side of the lane the body was found? The right-hand side, near the U. And the cigarette ends? The left. She nodded slowly. Then we may have had two visitors that night, Inspector. One expected, one not. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned home, her mind alive with speculation. She placed the scarf by the fire to dry, watching the wool darken as the ice melted away. Each drop that fell onto the hearth seemed to echo with memory, the rustle of footsteps, the hiss of breath in the cold. At length she rose and went to her writing desk. There she took up her notebook once again and wrote, New evidence, scarf, and clasp. 2 sets of footprints. London visitor to corner unknown connection. Motive still unclear. She paused, tapping her pen. Then below she added another line. Lucy protecting someone. The idea settled in her mind like a seed taking root. Lucy's trembling hands, her frightened glances, her insistence that she'd been in bed. All pointed not to guilt, but to fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was rarely solitary. That evening she paid another visit to Mrs. Partridge's cottage. Lucy's aunt answered the door, surprised. Good evening, Miss Marple. Come in out of the cold. Thank you kindly. I hope to see Lucy for a moment if she's in. Mrs. Partridge hesitated. She's lying down. Poor dear hasn't been herself. Miss Marple smiled gently. Perhaps I could just speak with her briefly. I won't stay long. A moment later, Lucy appeared, pale and red-eyed. She clutched a shawl about her shoulders. Miss Marple, she whispered, have they found anything? Perhaps a few small things, Miss Marple said kindly. But I came to speak of something else. You mustn't be frightened, my dear. Lucy blinked rapidly. Frightened? Of what? Of telling the truth, Miss Marple said softly. You were at the shop that night, weren't you? Later. Then you said. Lucy's hands trembled. I went back. I forgot my gloves, but I only stayed a minute. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. And Mr. Linton was still alive? Tears welled in the girl's eyes. Yes, he asked me to post a letter for him. He seemed so strange, Miss Marple. I didn't know what to do. A letter? Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Do you still have it? Lucy shook her head. No. I dropped it into the postbox by the green. Do you recall the address? Somewhere in London. To a Mr. A. Merrick, I think. Merrick, Miss Marple murmured. How very convenient. Was it important? Lucy asked. Perhaps more than you realize, Miss Marple said softly. But tell me, my dear, did anyone else see you? Lucy hesitated, then whispered, Mr. Alfred. He came just as I was leaving. I didn't tell the police. I was afraid. Miss Marple reached forward and took her hand. You did quite right to tell me now. Fear can be dangerous, but silence more so. When Miss Marple returned home that night, the moon hung low and white over the rooftops. She sat once more by the fire, her eyes distant. A letter to London, a missing visitor, a brother who claimed he hadn't left the inn. The pattern was forming. She took up her notebook and wrote one final line before extinguishing the lamp. Tomorrow, speak to Alfred. and find the letter. Chapter 5. The Widow's Secret. The next morning brought another gray sky over St. Mary Mead, the sort of dull, washed-out light that made even the most cheerful houses look weary. Miss Marple took her tea by the window, watching the frost melt into rivulets that traced patterns down the glass. She had spent half the night turning over Lucy's confession in her mind, the letter addressed to a Mr. A. Merrick, the London visitor, and Alfred's unexplained presence near the shop. But one question still gnawed at her. What had Peter Linton wanted so desperately to hide before his death? And who exactly had he been trying to protect? There was one person who might know: his widow, Beatrice Linton. When Miss Marple arrived at the Linton home, she found the curtains drawn and the fire unlit. Beatrice sat by the dining-room table, her hands resting on a folded black shawl. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, "you've come about the police again, haven't you?" "Not quite, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Sometimes they ask the wrong questions. I merely wanted to ask the right ones." Beatrice gave a weary smile. "You always did have a way of finding what others overlook." Miss Marple took the chair opposite her. "Tell me, Mrs. Linton, before your husband's death, did he seem frightened?" Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he'd been receiving letters from London. Business matters, he said, but he wouldn't show them to me. He burned one right in the hearth last week. Do you happen to know from whom?" She lowered her eyes. "From someone named Merrick. The same name that girl Lucy mentioned, I suppose." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Then we have a connection. Did he owe money, perhaps?" "Not exactly," Beatrice whispered. "He'd been hiding something, or rather someone's secret. He used to be clerk for a shipping company in London before we married. There was a scandal. Money gone missing, though nothing was proved. Peter always said the real culprit had paid him to keep quiet." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And that culprit was this Mr. Merrick?" "I believe so," Beatrice said. "The payment stopped years ago. Then, a few weeks ago, a letter came. Merrick wanted his old correspondence returned. Peter refused. Because it was his last protection," Miss Marple said softly. Beatrice nodded. "He feared Merrick might come for them. He hid the papers somewhere. I don't know where." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the old mahogany bureau in the corner. "Might I?" Beatrice hesitated, then gave a small nod. Miss Marple opened the top drawer carefully. Receipts, shop ledgers, old bills, all neatly filed. But tucked beneath the lining of the second drawer was a small, unmarked envelope. Inside were 2 letters, brittle with age. The first bore a London postmark from 1937 and was signed A. Merrick. "You shall keep these papers until I say otherwise. My reputation depends on it. Should anything happen to me, destroy them. You will, of course, be compensated." The second letter, dated only a week before Peter's death, was shorter and colder. "Our arrangement ends. Return the documents by Thursday night or the consequences will be yours." Miss Marple folded the letters carefully. "You didn't know of this, Mrs. Linton?" Beatrice shook her head. "No. He told me nothing, only that I was not to touch his desk." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Men always underestimate the intelligence of those who share their table." Beatrice gave a hollow laugh. "He was proud. But I never thought it would lead to this. You had no quarrel that evening?" Her expression changed. A flicker of pain. "We argued. I told him to go to the police if someone was threatening him. He said it was too late. Then he left the house just before 9. I never saw him again." "Did he take anything with him?" Beatrice hesitated. "His leather satchel. It wasn't found, was it?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It wasn't." She rose, closing the bureau gently. My dear, I fear your husband's death was the result of old sins catching up with him, and perhaps a mistaken act of loyalty from someone too young to understand the weight of secrets. Beatrice looked up sharply. Lucy? Possibly, Miss Marple said, or someone acting for her. But rest assured, Mrs. Linton, the truth, like a thaw, cannot be held back. Forever. Outside, the sky had darkened to a pale steel blue. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts turning over the puzzle once more. Merrick. The letters, the satchel, the scarf. Each thread wove tighter, leading her to one conclusion. The killer's motive was not rage nor love, but fear of exposure. And the person most afraid was not Lucy, nor even Alfred. It was someone who had everything to lose if those letters ever surfaced. By the time Miss Marple reached her gate, her expression had changed from mild concern to quiet certainty. Ah, yes, she murmured to herself, smiling faintly. The truth is finally beginning to thaw. She looked toward the frozen lane beyond the churchyard. Still, white and deceptively peaceful. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay Mr. Alfred Linton one final visit, and she would not be going alone. Chapter 6. Tea at the vicarage Sunday mornings in St. Mary Mead always carried an air of gentle ceremony. The tolling of the church bell, the smell of scones wafting from open kitchen windows, and the rhythmic crunch of parishioners' shoes over frost. The vicarage, a modest Georgian house wrapped in ivy, was warm and bright. Inside, Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda were hosting their usual post-service tea, a gathering that somehow managed to blend hospitality with unspoken curiosity. After all, since poor Peter Linton's death, the whole village seemed divided between sympathy and suspicion. Miss Marple, seated near the fire, stirred her tea with delicate precision. Across from her sat Alfred Linton, the victim's younger brother, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his gaze shifting uneasily between the vicar and the door. He had been invited, of course, motum for comfort. But Miss Marple knew comfort was seldom the true purpose of such gatherings. "Sugar, Alfred?" asked Griselda cheerily, pouring milk into his cup. Thank you. 2, if you please," he replied distractedly, glancing toward Miss Marple. "You've been keeping to yourself lately," she observed, smiling mildly. "That's never healthy in times of grief." Alfred gave a small, nervous laugh. "I suppose not. But there's much to sort at the shop and, well, Beatrice doesn't wish to see me much these days." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I imagine old wounds reopen easily in cold weather. But tell me, have you found your brother's satchel yet?" There was a brief silence, the kind that always follows when someone says something just a little too direct. Alfred's hand froze on his teacup. "Satchel?" he repeated. "Yes," Miss Marple continued pleasantly. "Beatrice mentioned it went missing the night he died. Rather odd, don't you think, that it's the one thing the police didn't find?" I don't know anything about that," Alfred said quickly. "He often misplaced things." "Indeed," she said. "But this was no ordinary item. It may have contained correspondence, letters from a Mr. A. Merrick, perhaps." The cup clinked against its saucer. Reverend Clement looked from one to the other, frowning slightly. "I beg your pardon?" Alfred said after a pause, forcing a thin smile. "But I've never heard of that name." Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes twinkling. "Curious? Because your brother burned one of those very letters in his hearth last week, and his widow still had 2 others hidden away. Quite incriminating if one were to read them closely." His face paled. "You've been to Beatrice?" "Of course. A widow often remembers what others forget." Alfred shifted uneasily. "Whatever this Merrick fellow did, it has nothing to do with me." "Oh, I think it does," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, Mr. Merrick arrived from London not long before your brother's death, and Lucy Hartwell, Your assistant, Cindy, wrote to him. She believed he might help Peter with a delicate matter. Yet he vanished the same night your brother died, Griselda gasped softly. Vanished? Quite. The police assume he returned to London, but I suspect he didn't get far. Are you saying Merrick killed Peter? Alfred demanded. Miss Marple's voice softened, almost kindly. No, my dear, I'm saying someone else did to protect him. He stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're accusing... Sit down, Alfred, the vicar said firmly. Let's hear her out. Alfred hesitated, then sank back into his chair, his breath shallow. Miss Marple continued in that same grandmotherly tone. Your brother had been blackmailing Merrick for years. Letters, evidence, payments, all neatly kept. But when Merrick came to reclaim them, something went wrong. I believe Peter threatened to expose him instead. Someone, perhaps someone young, impulsive, protective, took it upon themselves to intervene. Alfred looked up sharply. Lucy? She was fond of you, Miss Marple said quietly. Foolishly so. You took her in when no one else would, didn't you? Promised to help her start afresh after her father's troubles. His mouth opened, then closed again. You confided in her about your brother, Miss Marple continued. How he had ruined your prospects, how he belittled you. So when she saw him quarreling with Mr. Merrick that night, and later storming toward Frozen Lane, she followed. She thought you might be in danger. Griselda clasped her hands, her eyes wide. You mean she saw... Yes, said Miss Marple softly. She saw too much. And when Peter fell, perhaps during a struggle, perhaps by accident, she panicked. The scarf was hers, wasn't it? She tried to cover the body to hide the evidence. But you found her, and rather than let her hang, you took the blame upon yourself. Alfred's face had drained of all color. You can't know that, he whispered. I don't know, Miss Marple said kindly, but I observe. Your shoes, for instance, the polish on one sole but not the other. I dare say one was recently replaced, perhaps to disguise the tread of a footprint. His hands trembled. You don't understand. She's just a child. Miss Marple's eyes were sympathetic. Indeed. And you perhaps still a boy at heart, loyal to a fault. But secrets have a way of freezing over, Alfred. They look still until the thaw. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the church bell rang noon. At last, Alfred spoke, quietly, brokenly. She didn't mean to hurt him. He struck her when she tried to take the papers. She pushed back and he fell. I found them both, Peter dead, Lucy terrified. I took the satchel and burned the letters. I thought it would end there. Miss Marple nodded gently. I know, but the truth never ends quietly. It lingers. Reverend Clement exhaled slowly. You must tell the police, Alfred. Confession may yet bring mercy. He nodded, defeated. Yes, I suppose it must. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. I shall go with you if you like. It's always easier to face the cold with company. He looked up at her, gratitude flickering through the despair. You're very kind, Miss Marple, she smiled. Not kind, my dear. Merely practical. That evening, as she walked home through the soft mist, Miss Marple paused at the bend overlooking Frozen Lane. The snow had melted into a glassy sheen, reflecting the pale gold of the setting sun. Poor souls, she murmured. So much trouble over a few letters and pride. She turned toward her cottage, the faint smell of wood smoke greeting her from afar. The village, for all its secrets, seemed to breathe easier that night. Yet even as she closed her door, Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder. If the satchel had truly been burned, why had a scrap of charred paper been found far from Alfred's hearth? The puzzle, she realized, was not entirely solved. Not yet. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Scarf. The next morning dawned with an almost cruel brightness. Sunlight spilling across the frozen hedgerows, making every surface glitter, as if the village itself had been sprinkled with diamonds. But to Miss Marple it was the kind of deceptive beauty that hid danger beneath its charm. She had slept little. Alfred Linton's confession the previous day had unsettled her. Not because it lacked sincerity, but because it fit together too neatly. In her long experience, genuine truth rarely tied itself up with such tidy string. As she took her morning tea, a knock came at her cottage door. It was Constable Craddock, red-eared and puffing from the cold. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Sorry to bother, but I thought you'd best hear it before the gossip does." "Ah, news?" she asked, setting down her cup. "Aye. The police went through the Linton shop again last night just to be thorough. Found something rather queer. A scarf, pale blue wool, buried in the woodpile behind the shed." Miss Marple's brow lifted. "A scarf, you say?" "Yes, ma'am. Same one we thought belonged to that young Lucy Hartwell. Only it's clean as a whistle, not a speck of blood or dirt on it. Looks freshly washed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "How very interesting." Craddock nodded, scratching his chin. "If it was the murder weapon, someone's gone to a fair bit of trouble to make sure we can't prove it." She rose, fastening her cardigan. "Constable, might I take a look at it?" The scarf lay folded on a sheet of brown paper in the constable's office. Even through its careful laundering, Miss Marple noticed a faint scent, lavender soap and starch. "Lucy doesn't use lavender," she murmured. "Her scent is rosewater. She mentioned it herself when I last saw her." Craddock frowned. "Then whose scarf is it?" "That," Miss Marple said softly, "is precisely the question." She traced the edge of the wool with her finger. Neat, tight stitches, professional knitting. Not the sort of work a young girl would do. This was made by someone older with patience and practiced hands. "Mrs. Linton?" Craddock guessed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "An excellent deduction. She knits for the church bazaar every winter. But why wash it? Why hide it?" She folded the scarf again carefully. "I think, Constable, we should pay another visit to the widow." When they arrived at Beatrice Linton's house, the air inside felt colder than the frost outside. Beatrice greeted them at the door, pale but composed. "Miss Marple, Constable," she said, clutching her shawl. "I had a feeling you'd be back." "I'm afraid so, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "We've found something that may concern you. A blue scarf." For just a moment, Beatrice's expression faltered. It was barely perceptible, a flicker in the eyes, a tightening of the mouth. But Miss Marple noticed. "I don't know what you mean," she said quickly. "Lucy's scarf, perhaps." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Beatrice, yours. Lavender soap and starch. The scent you always use. You washed it recently, didn't you?" Beatrice's hands trembled. "It was in my husband's coat pocket after it happened. I didn't want the police to misunderstand." "Misunderstand what?" She hesitated, eyes glistening. "He was going to leave me, Miss Marple. I found the letters. I knew about the money, the blackmail. But what broke me was discovering that he was planning to run away, not just from Merrick, but from me, with that girl." "Lucy?" Beatrice nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. "He said she reminded him of his youth, that she made him feel alive again. He was going to take the money and go to London with her. I confronted him that night. We argued. He struck me. I snatched the scarf from around my neck and pushed him away. He stumbled, slipped on the ice. Her voice broke. He never moved again." Constable Craddock looked stunned. "Then Alfred's confession," Miss Marple sighed softly, "was made to protect Lucy." And Lucy's silence was meant to protect Alfred. Meanwhile, poor Beatrice tried to protect them both. And herself. Beatrice clutched her shawl tighter. It was an accident, I swear it. But when I saw Lucy running, terrified, I thought perhaps she could take the blame. It would be easier for the village to forgive a foolish girl than a bitter wife. Miss Marple's tone softened. And so you hid the scarf? Beatrice nodded miserably. Yes, I washed it that night, but it haunted me. Every stitch, every thread, it felt like he was still there. Constable Craddock cleared his throat awkwardly. Mrs. Linton, I'll have to take a statement. But given the circumstances, Miss Marple laid a hand on his arm. Perhaps, Constable, this is a matter best left for the inspector's discretion. After all, the law has its mercy. And accidents do happen on icy roads. Craddock hesitated, then nodded slowly. Aye, ma'am. I suppose they do. When they left the cottage, the sun had already begun to dip behind the church spire. Miss Marple walked silently beside Craddock, her breath a faint mist in the cold air. Strange business, this, he said finally. All that fuss, blackmail, letters, London men, and in the end it comes down to a quarrel between husband and wife. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Most crimes, Constable, are rather ordinary at heart. Only their wrappings make them appear grand. She looked back once at the Linton home, smoke curling from the chimney, the windows glinting faintly in the setting sun. Still, she murmured, there's one thing that doesn't quite fit. Craddock frowned. What's that, ma'am? The scarf, she said. If it truly was Beatrice's, how did Alfred know to hide a different one behind the shed? Craddock blinked. Different? But Miss Marple was already turning toward home, her eyes alight with quiet satisfaction. The human heart, Constable, she said softly. It always leaves traces, even when the snow covers everything else. I dare say by tomorrow the last piece will show itself. Chapter 8. The Chill of Truth. The morning air was sharp with frost, the kind that made every breath visible and every step on the lane feel fragile. Miss Marple wrapped herself in her thickest woolen shawl as she walked toward the Linton shop. Her mind was alive with possibilities. Questions about the scarves, the letters, and the lingering unspoken threads of fear. Though Beatrice had confessed to her accidental push, something about the second scarf found hidden behind the shed gnawed at her. How had it ended up there? Alfred could not have known where to hide it unless someone had guided him or misled him. Miss Marple paused near the shop, observing the frost crystals glinting on the roof. A shadow moved inside. Alfred was arranging goods behind the counter, his hands trembling slightly. Good morning, Alfred, she said, stepping in. He looked up quickly. Miss Marple, I didn't expect you. Nor I you, she said mildly. May I ask about the scarf behind the shed? Alfred swallowed. I thought it was Lucy's. I found it after everything happened. I hid it so she wouldn't be blamed. I didn't know it wasn't hers. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So someone else placed it there deliberately? Alfred looked puzzled. Someone else? Who? Someone clever, she said. Someone who knew what would happen if the police found it. At that moment, a light tapping sounded at the door. Lucy Hartwell stepped in, her cheeks pink from the cold. She carried a small bundle of papers and letters. Miss Marple, she whispered. I found these in the back room. I think they belong to Peter. They're letters from Merrick. Miss Marple took the bundle and spread the papers across the counter. As she read, her sharp eyes caught the pattern immediately. Invoices, receipts, and correspondence, all detailing blackmail payments. But one folded paper, slightly different from the others, caught her attention. It was a note written in Peter's own hand. If anything happens to me, hide the scarf. Trust only one person." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Ah," she murmured. So Peter had prepared a contingency plan. Lucy gasped. "He meant me?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, "but also possibly someone else entirely, someone he trusted, and who acted when the unthinkable happened." Alfred watched, anxiety etched across his face. "Then, someone used it to confuse the police?" "Exactly," Miss Marple replied, "and the person most likely to have done so is someone who knew Peter intimately and knew the habits of the household. Someone who would not think twice about misdirecting attention to protect another." He looked between her and Lucy. "But who?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Beatrice knew about the scarf, yes. Alfred hid it, yes. Lucy tried to dispose of it, yes. But the second scarf, the one hidden in the shed, had to come from someone outside all of them. Someone who had access to the shop and to Peter's personal effects. Someone overlooked until now." Alfred's lips parted, but he said nothing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Let me show you." She led them to the back room of the shop. Carefully, she lifted a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a small bundle, another scarf, twisted with string, and a tiny leather pouch containing coins and letters. Lucy gasped. That's the one. I threw it in the stream." "No," Miss Marple said. "You only tried. This one was hidden before you even arrived. Someone planned it carefully, knowing it would be misinterpreted." Alfred looked shocked. "But who would do that?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Someone who stands to gain if the blame falls elsewhere, and who had the cunning to play the part of an innocent bystander." The three of them sat in tense silence, the room filled with the faint scent of dust and old wood. Then Miss Marple spoke again. "Consider, my dears, the shopkeeper, Mr. Pritchard, who often helped Peter after hours. Quiet, polite, well-liked. He knew the layout of the shop, the habits of both brothers, and when Peter was alone. He knew how to hide evidence where the police would not think to look. And he was seen entering the shop the night Peter died, ostensibly to close accounts." Alfred's eyes widened. "Pritchard? That's absurd." "Not absurd at all," Miss Marple said firmly. "Pritchard was loyal to Peter, in his own way. But when Peter argued with Beatrice and then with Merrick, he realized Peter might be in grave danger. He hid the second scarf to protect Alfred and Lucy from suspicion and to ensure Peter's secret, the letters, the blackmail, would remain safe." Lucy's hands trembled. "He did it to protect us?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "From the law, from gossip, from fear. He may have also sought to protect Peter's memory. He acted with great foresight, which is why we were so misled until now." Alfred leaned back, rubbing his temples. All this time, and I thought it was me who was shielding Lucy." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "In a way, you were. But there is a hierarchy of care in St. Mary Mead. Some acts of loyalty are quieter than others." By mid-afternoon, the villagers had gone about their business, unaware that the final pieces of the puzzle were in place. Miss Marple, Lucy, and Alfred walked back through the frost-glazed streets. "Tomorrow," Miss Marple said, "we will visit Mr. Pritchard. We must thank him for his cleverness and ensure he explains the hiding of evidence to the inspector. By then, the truth will be complete." Alfred nodded slowly. "I think I understand now. The scarves, the letters, the misdirections. It wasn't just an accident, and it wasn't just protection. It was everyone trying to protect everyone else." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed. Loyalty, my dear Alfred, is sometimes as chilling as the frost, yet as necessary as the sun that thaws it." As they approached the lane leading to the churchyard, the snow shimmered in soft gold, quiet and still. Miss Marple paused, glancing down at her boots, tracing the faint outlines of footprints. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "we will complete the picture. And then the village may rest." Chapter 9. The frost melts. The morning dawned cold, but the sun was bright and strong enough to gild the frost-laden hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had spent a restless night, reviewing the tangled threads of the case in her mind. Each scarf, each letter, each confession led inevitably to one conclusion. The truth was ready to emerge. By 10 o'clock, she arrived at the vicarage where a select group had been summoned. Alfred Linton, Lucy Hartwell, Beatrice Linton, and, reluctantly, Mr. Pritchard, the unassuming shop assistant whose clever intervention had remained hidden until yesterday. Even Reverend Clement and his wife were present, serving tea and scones, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple gestured for everyone to sit. "Thank you all for coming," she said softly, but her eyes gleamed with certainty. "Today we will untangle the final threads of a very delicate affair." Alfred shifted nervously. Lucy clutched her shawl and Beatrice sat rigid, her hands clasped. Pritchard, for his part, appeared as calm and polite as ever, though the faint flush on his cheeks betrayed his awareness of his own importance in the unfolding story. Miss Marple began with a gentle smile. "We have, over the past week, examined 2 scarves, letters from London, and several confessions, each intended to protect someone else. Accidents, loyalty, misdirection, all these have brought confusion, yet all pieces have a purpose." She held up the pale blue scarf found behind the shed. "Beatrice, this scarf was yours. You removed it after the accident to avoid misunderstanding, correct?" Beatrice nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes. I only wanted to protect Lucy and Alfred." Miss Marple continued, turning to Alfred. "Alfred, your intention was to shield Lucy when you discovered Peter dead. You hid one scarf but were unaware of the second." Alfred swallowed hard. "Yes, I thought I was only protecting her." "And Lucy," Miss Marple said gently, "you attempted to dispose of the scarf in the stream. Your actions were driven by fear, not guilt. Correct?" Lucy nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Miss Marple, I was so frightened. I didn't want to cause trouble." Miss Marple paused, letting the room absorb these confessions. Then her sharp eyes turned to Pritchard. "And you," she said, "are the final piece of this puzzle." Pritchard's polite composure faltered. I don't understand." "You hid the second scarf," Miss Marple explained, "under the shop floor along with Peter's letters and coins. You knew Alfred would attempt to protect Lucy and Beatrice had removed her own scarf. By hiding this one, you preserved evidence, prevented false accusations, and protected all involved from the worst consequences of fear and confusion." He blinked, then bowed his head. "Yes, ma'am. I could not let a child or an innocent party be blamed. I only wished to protect them and Peter's memory." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed, loyalty can be more complex than simple honesty. Your actions, though seemingly clandestine, have ensured that justice is tempered with mercy." She then turned to Beatrice. "Mrs. Linton, your confrontation with Peter led to an accidental death. You pushed him in anger and fear. It was tragic but not malicious. Your intentions were protective as you hid the scarf and attempted to cover the event." Beatrice wept quietly. "I never meant. I loved him. I only wanted to protect everyone else." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And your love, even in error, guided your actions. The law will take accident into account, and the village will understand." Turning to Alfred, Miss Marple said, "Alfred, you acted with loyalty and courage, though perhaps naively. You hid what you believed could condemn Lucy, but your efforts were ultimately complemented by Pritchard's foresight. Alfred's eyes widened, gratitude and relief mingling. So, Lucy will not be blamed? No, my dear, Miss Marple replied. The truth is clear, and it is not Lucy who carries the weight of guilt. Miss Marple then recounted the sequence for clarity. Peter Linton received threatening letters from Mr. Merrick, who demanded the return of blackmail evidence. Beatrice discovered the letters and confronted Peter the night he planned to leave with Lucy. In a moment of anger and fear, Beatrice pushed him, causing his accidental death. Lucy, discovering the aftermath, attempted to hide the evidence to protect herself. Alfred intervened, hiding one scarf in an effort to shield Lucy from blame. Finally, Pritchard, aware of all circumstances, concealed the second scarf to prevent misinterpretation and ensure the truth could eventually be revealed. The room was silent, each person absorbing the full picture. Miss Marple smiled warmly. And so the frozen lane has thawed, revealing every hidden footprint, every act of loyalty, and every misstep. Each person acted out of love or fear, and each action compounded the next. But the truth, like the winter sun, always finds a way to shine. Reverend Clement cleared his throat. Miss Marple, your insight is remarkable. The village owes you its thanks as always. Beatrice reached for Alfred's hand. Lucy touched her own scarf nervously. Pritchard offered a small, self-effacing bow. For the first time in days, there was a sense of calm and order in the room. Miss Marple finally rose. The law will take its course, but I trust the authorities will consider the circumstances, and the village will offer the forgiveness that fear often obscures. Accidents, loyalty, and courage. These, my dears, are the true essence of our humanity. As she gathered her coat and hat, she glanced once more at the group. And now, she added, I believe it is time for tea. There is much to discuss and very little to fear. Outside, the frost had begun to glisten like crystal in the bright morning sun. St. Mary Mead appeared at peace again, the village's secrets laid bare yet softened by understanding. The frozen lane, site of tragedy and fear, now seemed simply a lane, quiet, reflective, and ready for spring. Miss Marple walked home slowly, a gentle smile on her lips. She had uncovered not only the truth, but the web of care and protection that bound the village together. Even in the darkest moments, she mused, human loyalty could illuminate the coldest paths. And tomorrow the village would awaken to a truth finally set free. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and the Truth. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, casting a warm golden light across the frost-softened rooftops. Birds chirped busily in the hedgerows, and the faint smell of baked bread and scones drifted from the baker's shop. Despite the tragedy that had passed through the village, a sense of quiet resolution had settled, like a soft blanket over the cobbled lanes. Miss Marple, neatly dressed in her favorite gray coat, set out for the vicarage, carrying her small teapot and a box of home-baked scones. The vicar and his wife had insisted on hosting a morning tea to celebrate clarity, understanding, and the unburdening of secrets. It was a tradition Miss Marple knew well. Tea, after all, had a way of smoothing even the sharpest edges of human worry. The vicarage smelled of lavender and toasted bread, and the table was laid with delicate china cups and plates. Alfred Linton, Lucy Hartwell, Beatrice Linton, and Mr. Pritchard were already present, sitting in quiet conversation. Though the air was tinged with solemnity, there was also warmth, a gentle acknowledgement that the worst had passed. Miss Marple placed the teapot on the table, pouring each cup with practiced care. "Tea, my dears?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you, Miss Marple," Beatrice murmured, her voice soft but calm. Alfred nodded, still looking thoughtful, while Lucy fidgeted with her scarf. Pritchard gave a polite nod, his composure restored, though he remained humble and modest. Once everyone was settled, Miss Marple began to speak, not with accusation or judgment, but with gentle clarity. "We have lived through quite an eventful week," she said. "And though Peter Linton's death was tragic, we have seen the complexity of human care and loyalty. Each action, each choice, stemmed from love, fear, and an attempt to protect one another. Nothing in St. Mary Mead was done out of malice." Beatrice sighed. "It is a comfort to hear that, Miss Marple. I feared the village would see me as cruel." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly. "Accidents, when paired with care and honesty afterward, can show the best of human hearts. You acted out of fear and sorrow, not cruelty." Lucy looked up, her eyes wide. "And what about me?" she whispered. "You, my dear, acted out of loyalty to Alfred and the family in the confusion of a frightful moment. You sought to protect, not to harm." Alfred, still looking shaken, said quietly, "And Pritchard, he hid evidence to protect all of us." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. He understood that misinterpretation could bring ruin where no ill intention existed. His foresight ensured that no one suffered unduly for an accident. In truth, he acted with wisdom and humility." Pritchard inclined his head. "I only did what seemed right, ma'am." "And right it was," Miss Marple said, smiling. The conversation drifted naturally to the letters from Mr. Merrick. Alfred explained how Peter had been blackmailed and how the letters had complicated everything. Miss Marple listened, sipping her tea, occasionally pointing out details that had previously gone unnoticed. The placement of the satchel, the timing of the confrontations, the role of the frozen lane itself in contributing to the accident. All of these elements, she said, combined to create a mystery more perplexing than any one person could have orchestrated. It was not the work of malice but of circumstance, fear, and human loyalty, all interwoven with the very ordinary mistakes we make when we act in haste. Beatrice, brushing a tear from her cheek, said softly, "I never realized how many people cared enough to protect one another." Lucy nodded, her small hands wrapped around her teacup. "I thought I was the only one. But everyone acted to help, even if it was in secret." Alfred exhaled slowly. "I feel as if a weight has lifted. The village will understand eventually." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed. And now the frozen lane need not frighten anyone anymore. Its secrets have been revealed, its mysteries solved, and its lessons learned." Reverend Clement cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, you have once again shown the wisdom and clarity that makes our village fortunate to have you. Would you care to join us for scones?" "Oh, but of course," Miss Marple replied, pouring more tea. "After all, mysteries are best digested slowly like a good scone with jam." Laughter rippled through the room, gentle and warm, as the tension of the past days began to dissolve. Teacups were filled, scones broken apart, and the aroma of fresh baking mingled with the sunlight pouring through the window. Miss Marple took a small bite of her scone, savoring the taste. Then she looked around at the faces of those present. Faces once shadowed by fear or guilt, now softened by understanding. "The truth," she said softly, "has a way of revealing itself. Sometimes it is hidden under layers of loyalty, fear, or accident. But eventually it is always found. And when it is, justice and compassion can coexist." Beatrice reached for Alfred's hand. Lucy smiled shyly. Even Pritchard seemed to glow with quiet satisfaction, proud that his careful actions had protected the innocent. Miss Marple took a final sip of tea, her heart light. St. Mary Mead had faced fear, misdirection, and tragedy. Yet the village had emerged intact, its bonds of care and community stronger than ever. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the frost-glittered lane outside. Soon spring would come, and with it, renewal. But for now, the village could rest, secure in the knowledge that truth, once uncovered, had a way of bringing warmth to even the coldest paths. As the group continued to enjoy their tea, Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes twinkling. She had solved the mystery of the frozen lane, unraveled the threads of fear and misdirection, and revealed the true roles of each player: Beatrice, Alfred, Lucy, and Pritchard. And in doing so, she reminded all present, and all who might hear this story, that human loyalty, even when complicated by accident and misunderstanding, could ultimately illuminate the darkest of winter days. The village of St. Mary Mead, quiet and cozy, breathed a collective sigh of relief, its heart warmed by honesty, understanding, and, of course, a good cup of tea.